Thank you, brothers and sisters. 25 years ago, the first assignment I was given after being put to work by the National Union, CWA, was to work on an organizing drive in Maryland. I flew back to Washington, D.C., flew to our old headquarters building, the Mercury building in Washington, and the first person to greet me was Larry Cohen. At the time, he was our organizing director, and in his office, he was like a force of nature. All over the walls were charts from what had to be 5 or 6 different projects that he was working at the same time. And he was very intense, very focused, and I remember being immediately impressed. And one of the first things he did was ask me my opinion of what I thought of this assignment. And at that stage of my life and career, being asked for my opinion was, quite a novel thing. But I realized with Larry, and I could just tell, this is not a person that I needed to parse my thoughts with. This wasn't a person I needed to sugarcoat my thoughts with. I needed to be direct and not hedge, despite what the consequences might be. And I gave him my direct opinion. And what I said is kind of lost in the haze of time, but it must have been a real doozy. Because the consequences were that Larry decided immediately I needed a mentor, and I needed a mentor badly. And he stepped right into that role, and on that very day started a friendship that's grown every day since then. Larry Cohen's driven by an intellect, a vision, a passion, and a boundless hope. His life is totally dedicated to working men and women and their families. And in a time of unrelenting attacks by corporate money mongers and the ever-growing fascist right wing, his drive and energy grows with every challenge. Larry's in the forefront of the call to coalesce all the allies that we have and everybody that seeks to reestablish a fair deal in this country. Through resistance, unrelenting resistance, and a non-stop fight for justice. I'm proud that Larry's my president, and I can't adequately ever express the depth of my feelings for the brotherhood that he shows me every day that I work with him and talk with him and work in this movement. Brothers and sisters, President of the Communications Workers of America, Larry Cohen.
Thank you. Thank you, sisters and brothers, and thanks, Jim, for those warm words. And back to you, brother. And as the CWAers know, this is a time of sadness for us. We lost an amazing brother on Friday. Jim is our leader for the West here, which goes all the way to Guam in our case, but Nevada, Hawaii, California. There's 7 regions, and the leader of our region in the Great Lakes drowned on Friday, and his wife narrowly missed drowning as well. And it's unspeakable, but it's better if I say that, because I can share that feeling, so you'll know what I'm feeling. Seth was a great movement builder, as you heard from Jim. And just as we met 25 years ago, that's when Jim met Seth. I met Jim. Lots of us here in CWA have roots that go back like that, and not just the time we spend together, but the values and what we share. So it's great to be here in California, although briefly I will be on that night flight to Cleveland and be with his family and with our locals there tomorrow morning. So, you probably know this, and probably a lot of people would stand up here and tell you this, but this state Fed is our giant. It's you, it's Art, it's this leadership. It sets a standard for this country. Many of the labor councils here do as well about what a labor movement can be. And when we think about the history here in this city, the general strikes from 68 years ago, and then in Oakland there was another one after World War II, I think the last one we had in this country. But the way you do your work, the way you do your work when you stand up for each other in lockouts like Boron or bargaining fights like we have right now across our entire union, 20,000 here in this state fighting to get a decent contract from AT&T, but also here at ABC Television, flight attendants that are in our union, etc. Now I've left out some, but point being that this is the place to figure out what is possible, Art, for labor in this country in a incredibly dark time. We're here, there's still a beacon in terms of the political work you do, the legislative work you do, the organizing work you do, the way you stand up for each other, and the way in which so many areas of this state, like this place we're standing in, sitting in now, it makes a huge difference which side you're on for working class people. And again, a particular shout out to Jim and the CWAers that are here, and the solidarity that you feel with each other, no matter where you come from in our union. It's our values, which we all share here, but particularly our values that make us strong, not which company you work for or what job you do, but the fact that we are willing to stand up, fight back, build a resistance movement, no matter what we face. So, I know you've talked about this a lot, but I can't come here and not talk about 32. Because of how critical California is. This fight on 32 is not just a California fight. You set, again, a standard in either direction. I think you've been through some version of this fight at least 3 other times, 2 other times.
2 other times.
And each time, because of the way you can organize here, because of the way you talk to each other and knock on doors and go to work sites, you've prevailed, not just on this, but on a list that would take up all my minutes here, all kinds of issues. And I'm going to come back to this sort of in a broader way when I talk a little bit about our view of movement building, as Jim said, why we have to be so broad in terms of the movement at this time. But some of our own members here, just as in Wisconsin, will get confused on 32 because people will say, you didn't like Citizens United? Vote yes on 32. And that confusion is stirred up by multi-millionaires and billionaires and right-wingers. And yes, some of them, Jim, we should call fascists because they are fascists. They want to control every aspect of our life. And so the messaging in here, Art, I went through this toolkit, and Art doesn't leave much to chance. He had sent me a lot of this before I came. I know nobody here has experienced Art Pulaski, right? And, you know, you look at the goals, messaging-wise, and those broader goals are so critical if we're going to restore the democracy in this country and keep the kind of democracy that you have helped build here in California. and that our members understand that, in fact, we support, every one of us, repealing Citizens United, but it must be in a meaningful way where we stop the billionaires who are dominating our lives in this country, not working class people, from having a voice. And we all know that's what this is about for them. And you've talked about that already, and you'll talk about this more, but we know who they are. They're the people who move our jobs out of this country. They're the people who come to us, union and much worse, not organized, and say, we'll take care of you. You don't need collective bargaining anymore. They're the people who come to us and say, we just need some help to keep investing here. We need to cut the health care that you've had. And if you're retired, we're sorry, but we can't afford to keep the commitments we've had to you. They're the people who say, we can't have pensions anymore. They're the people who say, we need a pay cut if you want to keep your job, not a pay raise. They're the people who, more than any others, have got us in this worst economic catastrophe in 60 or 70 years. But of course, they want to tell the story a different way. They have a different narrative to tell. They want to blame working class people for the problems in this country. They want to blame unions. They want to still our voice. They'll talk about the First Amendment and the Constitution as if it was yesterday. But in today's terms, they want to dominate the media. They want to control every workplace. They want their financial contributions to be called free speech. As all too often, they dominate both political parties. They certainly own the Republican Party at this point in history like they never have before. And so I know that Art and this leadership and all of you, as you leave this hall, will commit to that fight, and hopefully we will all back you up in that fight as much as we possibly can, because it's about our democracy. It's not just another question on a referendum, and it's what will that democracy look like, as we heard from Wisconsin. And what it doesn't look like is billionaires controlling and doing what they want, and then restricting our organizations. So we passed out a short version of a longer conversation called Democracy and Economic Justice. It looks like this. So you all have that. And I'm going to focus on that for a few minutes. And that is one chart from, you see on the bottom, a website. So if anyone's interested, you can go there and download this. So how many folks here went to the 99% spring training? You see the CWAers. That was voluntary, right, when you guys went? Okay. So this is sort of our version of that, and it comes down to this chart, and then what do we do about it? And as Jim said, we believe more than ever that this movement, even as strong as it is in California, must help build and be part of a broader movement. And why is that? So again, in the booklet, we start out with a chart that you all know too well. It shows the rise of collective bargaining. Starting in the mid-30s, it was at 8%. And cities like this one, and Minneapolis and Toledo, many others. Workers rose up, took incredible risks, and built a new working class movement. And so by 1950, and really right through the 50s in the private sector, more than 1/3 of all workers had bargaining rights in this country. So it went from 8% to about 35%, rising up. taking risks in the streets, not just sort of in some narrow corridor called the law of the land. And spread to the public sector, and many here are public sector workers now. And so before that period, before World War II, there was virtually nowhere in the country where there were bargaining rights of any kind, meaningful kind, except for some cities, for public workers. And so there's sort of a disconnect. The public worker movement sort of started then, working off the political clout that private sector workers had built, but also the militancy of public workers, not only here, but across the country. And as you all know, Dr. King was assassinated standing up for sanitation workers who were robbed of really all their rights at that time and were on strike for more than 100 days when he went to Memphis in that fight. And so today, about 30%, a little more, of public workers have bargaining rights, but today we're back below the 8% in the private sector. And obviously this is critical to all of us because this is our movement. This is what we have to work with, whether it's to mobilize on Prop 32 or the bargaining fights that our union and every union here has that always feel like you're clinging to a cliff. Can we hold on to what people did before us? Well, why is that? Because particularly in the private sector, when you're at 6.9%, it means that 14 out of 15 workers in this country don't have any hope of having bargaining rights. You don't have the kind of movement that's where we're rising up. You have the kind of movement where we're holding on, and that's certainly what it feels like to me. It doesn't matter which sector in our union. But it isn't just our story. Between World War II and about 1970, as all of us in every job we're in, the people who came before us, increased productivity in that incredible boom period, our wages went up at the same rate. Now this part you'll hear about from lots of folks. The fact that productivity since the early 70s, 40 years, has continued to go up and wages are stagnant. But the part that they leave out, even most Democrats who we end up supporting, is that the reason wages are stagnant or declining job for job for 40 years, and that does not exist in any other democracy or even places like China, where they have lower wages, but they've had rising wages. But that does not exist in any other democracy, 40 years of that kind of stagnation of wages while productivity has climbed, created more trillions of dollars in corporate banks, accounts, or whatever they call them, that they don't invest in any longer, is directly linked to that bargaining graph and that story. Because if productivity goes up, we produce more, and wages are stagnant, and we can't raise our wages because we have no seat at the table. Most of us have no seat, and those of us who have a seat, it's like you barely do. And so, why are we surprised that the economy can't recover this time? Now, this has been getting worse for 40 years. So all the economists, at least not all the economists, but the ones that would be, quote, on our side in some way, they all see that as a problem, but they all have gimmicks instead of bargaining rights is the answer. And, I just read something today that, even folks on our side sent out, and again, it's all about, tax cuts, raise the minimum wage. These are fine things, for the most part. Spend more money on public works. These are things that generally we would all support. The problem is, if we continue to be the only democracy in the world, and I'm talking about Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Taiwan, they all have rising labor movements. Argentina, Uruguay, places that when I was growing up in this labor movement had no rights. People like us were in jail. If we can't restore a time where working class people can sit at the table and bargain, public and private sector together, and if the people we elect don't understand how central that is, it's not the only factor, but it's a critical factor that explains the difference right now between the United States for working people and virtually everywhere else in the world. Even Angela Merkel, the leader in Germany, center-right she's considered in European terms, from the CDU. At the recent meeting of the G20, and they, all kinds of bullshit at those meetings. But she said very clearly, we don't need to spend as much on public stimulus of that type in Germany because we have bargaining rights in Germany. We have co-determination in Germany. And so we stimulate the economy in Germany, center-right, remember this. Because workers bargain, they get raises, they can buy things, and we don't need to do all kinds of other stuff. And so we come to this chart. And the longer version of that narrative, again, you can get to on that website. And so this is a CWA thing. I don't mean to speak for everybody, but these four issues you see in the center up there, economic justice, pretty much are our issues, collectively. There's certainly been our issues since 2005, written like that. In fact, the woman who I call the best speaker ever, who lives right here, in 2000 and in that same period, Nancy Pelosi, George Miller had a list not exactly like this, but similar, as they talked about how do we regain a majority. And this list, secure jobs, fair trade, health care for all, retirement security, bargaining and organizing rights, is what we all pretty much share here. Again, different organizations here might have a different version of it, but it's pretty much, our labor movement. And when we won those elections, 2006, 2008, created supermajority in the House of Representatives, which is the People's Congress. We had overwhelming majorities for all of those things. With your work and leadership, a lot of it came right out of California in that House of Representatives, by a 60% margin. That Congress, led by Pelosi, passed the Employee Free Choice Act by 60%, passed a health care bill way beyond the Affordable Care Act that would have required every employer in this country to provide decent health care. Promoted trade policy that would have kept jobs in this country like every other country does, not based on protection, but based on fair trade. Protected Social Security and would have protected our pensions. And we go over here on the left side, President Obama, his campaign now for fair taxes, more infrastructure projects, public services. Or on the right side up there, the partner issues, climate change, the DREAM Act, fighting foreclosures, many others. This is what the American dream's about, those things. And what this chart is about is to say to us, we got a real democracy problem in this country. So on that wall, the limits of our democracy are our version of campaign finance reform. Get the billionaires out of politics, not the unions. The Senate rules, none of those bills I talked about that Pelosi led, none of them got discussed on the floor of the Senate for a second. None of them. The worst Senate rules ever, even though we had a Democratic majority in the Senate. Now Harry Reid, thankfully, better late than never, has said repeatedly in the last few weeks If we have a Democratic majority in January, we're changing the rules so that we have real discussion, real debate. How about a real democracy? Voter suppression, 38 states. Most recently, Michigan. Again, the right-wing free speech paid for by billionaires says we have a voter fraud problem. We need to have everybody, whether they have a driver's license or not, go to motor vehicle if they want to vote, blah, blah, blah. There's no voter fraud in this country. You couldn't measure it. You can't find it. Those 38 laws, again, they suck our people in because they have unlimited funds to convince people that the problem's voter fraud, not the lowest turnout rates of any democracy in the world. Still fresh in my mind, a YouTube video of a teacher in Florida after she dared to register civics class, her seniors. She dared to register them. She then turned in the registration. She got fined $1,000 in Florida because she hadn't turned them in within 48 hours. That's not what democracy looks like. And a legalization path for immigrants. The other side knows that immigrants are working class people. And when they are able to have a path to citizenship, like every other generation of immigrants had, they vote like working class people, and that's why there's no path. I said recently to our members in South Carolina, to our members in CWA, in a conference like this, from that region, lots of us don't understand that issue very well. Again, that's no accident. It's because of the so-called free speech and what they pay for. But before 1920, there weren't any immigration laws in this country. And I'm sure I'm not the only person here whose family who came here back then, before then, were not necessarily, like PhDs and Nobel laureates and, people of any means whatsoever. We'd have a way of revising our own history. In my own case, it was worse than that, but we don't need to go there. But once you got off the boat, once you crossed the border from Mexico back then, you were here 4 or 5 years, you had a clear path to citizenship. That's what we called the American dream. Are we saying the American dream was only there for our forefathers and is not here for the people who take care of our kids, who take care of our parents, who cut the lawn, who build buildings, who hang out on skyscrapers? And so, the point of all this is that for any of us, it doesn't matter where we came from. If we believe in those economic justice things that affect every one of our families, if we understand that the election in 2008 for us was a watershed, that's as good as we can do. We need to look deeply. We need to understand that. That was a clean sweep. And they stole the dream back from us. Deliberately. They knew what that election meant. They knew why people around the world were cheering. Now, everybody doesn't come here and say that. Or more importantly, outside of a room like this. That dream was stolen, not just from dreamer kids, from every one of us. And we need to understand how we're connected, whether we're a dreamer kid or whether we're an older leader of this movement. If we're here to fight for jobs and fair trade and health care and retirement security, and most importantly for those of us in this room, bargaining and organizing rights again, we need to build, as we say here, a coalition not only to win elections, which is critical, this election in November, but a movement as we saw in Madison, a movement as we saw here decades ago, where we're willing to be in the streets as well as the ballot box. We're willing to talk to our sisters and brothers and say, if not now, when? Stand up and fight back. If not now, when? And so we can do this. There is a natural coalition, and again, California can lead this. You do lead this. You will lead this. That when we form the bonds that you've done here with Latinos and civil rights groups and women and students and seniors and labor and progressives and environmentalists and LGBT and faith-based social justice group and community organizations, those numbers add up to 70 million people in this country. And we won't get every last one of those, but we can get majorities, huge majorities of those groups. We have to define our movement in those terms. We have to understand how the limits of this democracy have almost eliminated democracy. We have to dig deep. We have to go back to what we learned when we were young, or if we didn't learn it, we have to learn it now, while we still have the kind of strength that's in this room and in this movement. And this will be messy. It's not going to be neat to build that kind of movement. Even this is messy. We don't agree on lots of stuff here, but we come here and we leave, and we're united, and we have a vision, we have a movement. In our union, it's messy. CWA, you got lots of people disagree, lots of time. That's great. We get our strength that way. But we have to get our strength that way. And lots would say to me, well, you know, you build something broader than this? What, are you kidding? This is hard enough. And it is. But if we don't build that movement that links together our own vision and dreams for economic justice, and we don't link that to these natural allies, and we get split up because of the noise we will hear from the billionaires, when it's a great investment for them. They want to get rid of the small, pathetic taxes they pay. They invest in political noise. And they convince our own people that while they save $100 million, we save $100, but we should vote their way. And so, as you're doing, Art, you have another referendum question about how do we fund the public services that we need. And the key is, how do we build the unity that we need? So we don't see what I saw, the polling results in Wisconsin. And again, we should take huge courage from Wisconsin and what our members and community folk did, and students, young people, whole families. I know they showed the film here. I saw it, We Are Wisconsin. If you haven't seen it, get it, because you get a sense of what that means. What does democracy look like? It's not just about an election where all kinds of other things factor in. But in that election, the billionaire supporting Walker convinced half of our members in the private sector to vote for Walker, and particularly older members and retirees. They were able to split up this notion of public and private. And they did the same, obviously, to a greater extent with people who are not in our movement. And so we have to go deeper. We have to understand that we need this broad narrative where everyone finds their place. Whether it's a dreamer kid who grew up here, it wasn't even up to them, or our oldest retiree who we cherish. We need a common narrative that tells this story. You know, we're not fools. We can't have ourselves split up like this. It doesn't matter whether we're building trades or public sector or industrial union. It doesn't matter where we come from. It's these values and what we stand for, and believing deeply that we can go back and build the movement we need. And so when they come with 32, we say no. And when they come with union busting and give-backs, we say no. And when they come, as we'll be out there this afternoon in that rally, when they come and take our jobs and move them in the name of free markets, we say no. But we also say si se puede. We also say yes. We also say yes for democracy. We say yes for economic justice. We say yes for the American dream for all of us. We say yes, yes, yes. We are ready to stand up and fight back. Stand up, fight back. Stand up, fight back. Stand up, fight back. Stand up, fight back.